The number of people reporting having no close friends has quadrupled in the past 30 years. We are in a friendship crisis, and if you aren't worried, you will be by the end of this video. Life is a shadow of itself without friends, and don't just take my word for it. Today, we will look at one of the greatest philosophers in history, Aristotle, and how he saw his nearest and dearest. We'll look at how to tell a true friend from a false one, why good friendships hold priceless value, and lastly, we'll be looking at Aristotle's tips for making true friends, and how I use them to go from someone with no friends to someone with a vibrant social circle. So, let's get started. 1. The 3 types of friend. Think of the friendships you've had in your life and what bound you together. You will likely call to mind some friends who you just enjoyed your time with. They were brilliant company, and you could always rely on them for a fun evening. Another might be someone that you would loosely call a friend, but was really just using you for some material advantage. If you're very lucky, you might call to mind a friend that you share deep values with. Someone who's not only pleasant company, but who you could turn to in a time of need. Who you could happily rely on and who could happily rely on you. Someone who doesn't just think of your short-term pleasure, but looks out for your long-term fulfillment. And someone who could steer you back on track when you begin to betray your principles. This last type is true friendship, according to Aristotle. He calls the first 2 types of friendship friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility, respectively. But true friendships, or friendships of virtue, as Aristotle calls them, are the holy grail of companionship. Take me, for example. I am lucky enough to have a lot of people whose company I genuinely enjoy, but by far my greatest gift is that I have a small collection of very good friends who are emblematic of everything a friendship of virtue must be. They are not only incredibly supportive of what I do, but they push me to become better. And on the occasion where they've seen me start to turn away from my principles and morph into somebody that I dislike, they've immediately called me out on it. I remember on one particular occasion I had crawled into a depressive hole and was just not talking to anyone. I hadn't had a shower in an embarrassingly long time, and I stopped doing anything that gave my life meaning. And I immediately noticed that my truest friends were the ones that snapped me out of it. They gave me the sort of tough love that I needed to hear to jolt me back into action. A friend of pleasure might have let me degenerate, thinking that it was not their problem. And a friend of utility might have discarded me as just not worth having anymore. But my true friends gave me the hard shove that I needed to finally get out of my condition. And they did it even when I was being a grumpy bastard the whole time. And I think this is what distinguishes the mark of a friend of virtue. A friend of pleasure might miss your company and they might want the best for you so that you can be a good drinking buddy again. But a friend of virtue wishes you well for your own sake. I know a pair of best friends who have stuck by one another through thick and thin. When the mother of one of them fell gravely ill, their best friend even moved in with them for a little while to help out, at considerable personal expense. And they did this because they were not seeing their friend as some means to an end, but an end in themselves. They saw their friend as valuable in their own right. And as a general rule of thumb, this is the mark of a true friend. But if we have them, how do we keep them? This is our next point. If you want more on philosophy and the art of learning, subscribe to my email list. The link is in the description. 2. The duties of friendship. A true friendship is a little bit like a garden. If you tend to it carefully, it will flourish and grow. But if you neglect it, overwater it, or just forget about it entirely, it will degenerate. This is precisely what Aristotle thought friendship was like. We are not used to thinking of ourselves as owing particular obligations to our friends. One of the great developments of Enlightenment moral philosophy was that it encouraged us to see people from a third-person perspective, and to view our friends and family as no more valuable than anyone else. But to Aristotle, this would seem like madness. And I think that secretly, a lot of us agree with them, even if we won't say it out loud. Sure, if we're thinking objectively, we would say that a person should not give their friends special treatments, morally speaking. But our moral judgments in the world rarely reflect this. Who would you judge more harshly? A man who attacked a random person on the street, or a man who attacked his own mother? I bet most of you would say that the man who attacked his own mother seems somehow worse, even if you can't put your finger on why. And so we should at least consider that we owe some special obligations to our friends. Aristotle's reasoning on the matter is remarkably simple. Our true friends of virtue add a lot to our lives. They enrich our experience of the world. Think about it. If you have someone who you can truly call your close friend, who is there for you in times of trouble and who turns the world from a lonely and uncaring place to one that can be comfortable and familiar, surely you would owe a lot to that person. And this debt is paid off through your special obligations to them, according to Aristotle. So you have a duty to enrich their lives just as they enrich yours. My nan was a wonderful woman, and she used to tell me when I was very little, if someone makes you happy, make them happier. This is Aristotle's approach to true friendship in a nutshell. And it's easy to see how this attitude can further enhance the friendship. There is the potential for a great upward spiral. You do a good deed for a friend, and they in turn try to help you, prompting you to help them further. This is not a transaction. attraction, but just the natural result of two people who hold a deep love for one another and wish the best for each other. And for Aristotle, these duties extend to making time for your friends. How many of you have fallen out of touch with your friends in the years since you've met them? There might be a school friend who you used to profoundly appreciate, but life has taken over and you just haven't had the chance to call them in years. You might have once been very close with your parents, but over time you've just drifted apart. Aristotle reminds us to keep putting active effort into these connections. After all, these people are what make our lives worth living, so making time for them is the very least that we could do. And this principle of mutual aid brings us nicely onto our next point. 3. The principle of equality. Could you be friends with someone who held you in contempt? Could you be friends with somebody that you somehow felt superior to? Aristotle says no, and in doing so demonstrates the loneliness of feeling superior to your fellow man. In Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, I'm always struck by the deep isolation of its protagonist, Victor Frankenstein. He is consumed by his own intelligence and begins to think of himself as superior to everyone around him, to such an extent that he thinks he can play God with life itself. As a result of this feeling of superiority, he manages to alienate himself from pretty much everyone for the first half of the novel. He does not speak to his family, he has lost contact with his only friend, and all he thinks of is his solitary work. His loneliness not only causes him to become deranged, but also means he has no one to deter him from making the monster that will eventually kill many members of his family. And it all stems from his stubborn belief that he is far better than the people around him. Friendship can only occur between two people who perceive one another as equals. If someone thinks they're superior to others, they just will not deem potential friends worthy of their time. And if someone thinks of themselves as inferior to others, they will expect hostility from their fellow man. After all, from their perspective, they're inferior, so it's just what they would deserve. And Aristotle here has unwittingly made an incisive criticism of how arrogance can lead to loneliness and suffering. I say unwittingly here because Aristotle actually did believe that some people were superior to others, but that's a story for another day. The key takeaway here is that friendships of virtue can only exist between those who acknowledge one another as equals, and generally between people who share the same values and virtues. And this may help us take stock of our own friends. Are there any that perceive themselves as superior to you? Are there any that just fundamentally don't share your values? Aristotle would say that no true friendship can arise here. So in such cases, it is best to move on with your life. I also think Aristotle here gives us a potential lens through which we can view abusive friendships or abusive relationships more generally. He points out that someone who views themselves as superior is likely to view their friendship with their perceived inferior as simply one of utility, since they're unlikely to find their company pleasant and certainly don't consider them a true friend. As a result, the superior person is likely to see themselves as entitled to far more from their friend than their friend is willing to give. After all, they're the superior party and so deserve the better part of the benefits. Hence, an abusive dynamic can arise where the so-called superior person dominates and terrorizes their so-called friend. I'm sure many of us have been in such situations, and they are deeply unpleasant. But Aristotle has unintentionally shone some real light on their cause and how they can become so damaging. 4. Aristotle's Guide to Making Friends. 5 years ago, I found it very difficult to make true friends. This was for two main reasons. The first was that I did not like who I was, and the second was because I would hide my real personality behind a carefully managed disguise. In my late teenage years, I was bitterly unhappy, and as a result, I became spiteful and mean in my thoughts. I rarely wished good upon people, and quite often wished them ill so that I could use their failure to soothe my wicked resentment. However, I did have enough self-awareness to recognise that people would not like this, and so I cloaked it behind an insincere smile and a faked pleasant demeanour. But this approach was a disaster in all sorts of ways. I was an unpleasant person on the inside, but also I didn't even show that to the world. So any friendships that I did make were on false pretenses, and they wouldn't have liked my real personality anyway. I spent a lot of time bemoaning this fate to myself, as if it was anyone else's fault but my own. But eventually, I decided to take action. I began to work incredibly hard to change the contents of my thoughts. For each angry or spiteful idea, I would immediately counter it with a kind thought. I practiced just sitting and wishing well on people, and I started to slowly develop a real feeling of gratitude towards others. This took a really long time, but I eventually morphed the texture of my mind from someone who was fundamentally unkind to someone who was not perfect, but generally wished others well. And this then meant I felt far more confident in showing my actual personality to the world. I did not feel like I needed to hide myself, but I began to wear my thoughts on my sleeve, and the strangest thing began to happen. People began to like me for me. I was very skeptical at first, but eventually the evidence became incontrovertible. And this is perfectly in line with what Aristotle says. One of my favourite quotes of his is, "You can't just love love anything, you can only love what is lovable. Because that quote was what snapped me out of my spiral and caused me to actually work to become a friendlier person. He also says that true friendships of virtue can only exist between virtuous people. And since honesty is a virtue, they can thus only exist between people who are being honest with one another about who they are. If people only love the polished presentation you present, then they are not loving you. They are just loving your mask. And this is a part of Aristotle's philosophy that I think is particularly applicable today. We are under increasing pressure to present ourselves and our lives as perfect. We are encouraged to hide our mistakes, our shortcomings, and our moral failures at all costs. But in doing this, we cut ourselves off from real connections. Someone can only like you for you if they experience you as you. And they cannot do this if you don't drop the PR machine for a moment and simply open up. I'm not suggesting you need to burst into tears at the pub with your mates, but rather that you present an honest version of who you are to the world. It is frankly a terrifying thing to do, and it's a miracle that anyone manages it. But it's worth working to slowly chip away your external presentation. Stop hiding the interests that you're embarrassed about. Start to show your friends the parts of you that you are afraid they will dislike. If not, then true friendship will be forever out of your reach. According to Aristotle, it is only possible to have a few true friends anyway. So there is no sense in trying to make everyone like you. You don't need everyone you meet to like you a little. You need a few people to like you an awful lot. Feel free to present a sanitized version of yourself to the world when you're just dealing with strangers. But try and drop it when you're around people you consider to be your true friends. But all of this advice will be useless if you end up friends with an outright narcissist. So check out this video to take a peek inside the narcissist's mind and explore its vile innards. And subscribe for more on thinking to improve your life.